Ladies and gentlemen, if you can hear me, please take your seats because the session is about to begin. So we've now arrived at the first working session, which tackles the first big conversation that, as you heard earlier on in the day, the ILO is tackling as part of their centenary goals. This is the idea of work and society. For the past century, as many of us in this room well know, the role of work has been about more than just feeding the family and material fulfillment. A stable job is often people's identity, and it plays a crucial role in forming the glue that binds whole communities together, particularly in the developed world, as well as to a certain extent in the developing world. But obviously the relationship between worker and the employer is changing these days. The relationship is becoming increasingly informal with the advent of platforms like, for instance, dare I say, Uber and Airbnb. That has benefits, but it was also concerning a lot of people. And it's true to say that maybe in a generation from now, there may be rafts of people who may never have known the formal employment structures that we enjoy today here in this room. So we're going to be talking about that for the next 2 hours. Let me introduce our range of experts on this subject here. From my right, we have Isabelle Daugareilh, who's from the CRNS in France. Isabelle Daugareilh will be speaking in French, so I just want to advise you to make sure that you have your headsets ready if you would like simultaneous translation from her. Imraan Valodia, here sitting on my right, is from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. We also have Marcel van der Linden of the International Institute for Social History in the Netherlands. And last but not least, here on my left, Professor Thandika Mkandawire from the London School of Economics. And we have two reactors here from the world of the employers, Philip Woolford, Clairmark Consulting, that's and part of the Canadian Employers Council as well, so you're an employer who's going to be reacting to the policy recommendations that will probably come out of this panel, and Philip Jennings over here from the UNI Global Union here in Switzerland is representing the workers. So let's get straight to the topic at hand, work and society, and I'm going to start out by asking Isabelle Daugareilh what she thinks of the role of work in society, because it strikes me as somebody personally who's been educated in French, brought up in Britain, where there's very different attitudes towards the responsibility of the employer and the employee. Work is very sacrosanct in France. How do you view the nature between the employer, of the relationship between the employer and the employee? There's a sacrosanct relationship there. How do you think that that is going to change in Europe, and particularly with the French context?
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais tout d'abord indiquer combien je suis heureuse et flattée de participer à cette réunion sur une réflexion sur l'avenir du travail. Je suis juriste de droit social, donc je vais répondre à cette question générale qui est plutôt d'ordre philosophique, sociologique et historique, mais je pense que plus tard je m'exprimerai plutôt en tant que juriste. Quand vous dites que le travail est quelque chose de sacro-saint en France, il faut peut-être faire attention parce que, comme vous le savez, d'abord, le travail n'a pas toujours été quelque chose de sacro-saint. Dans la Grèce antique, le travail, c'était les esclaves et la liberté, c'était la politique. C'était faire de la politique, c'était donc ne pas travailler. Donc, en fait, le travail est devenu quelque chose de sacro-saint, non pas d'ailleurs à la faveur de l'Église catholique, pas du tout, mais à la faveur de l'Église protestante, ce qui fait que le terme de sacro-saint pourrait être mal pris par peut-être l'Église protestante. En tout cas, c'est Max Weber, c'est l'éthique protestante, la valorisation du labeur comme source d'épanouissement, comme insertion dans une société. Et cette place centrale du travail s'est complètement épanouie avec l'industrialisation donc au XVIIIe, XIXe et même XXe siècle. Mais on peut dire que cette place n'a pas, même dans le langage, n'a pas toujours été quelque chose de positif. Dans la langue française, le bourreau, celui qui exécutait les criminels, s'appelait le travailleur jusqu'au XVIIIe siècle. Donc, ce que je veux dire par là, c'est qu'on a eu une inversion de la place du travail, de la valeur du travail dans l'histoire assez remarquable, quasiment révolutionnaire. Alors, évidemment, le travail a connu en France, la notion de travail a fait l'objet de travaux dans les années 90 qui ont prôné quasiment la fin du travail. De nombreux sociologues, et parmi eux, une des plus célèbres, Dominique Méda, a écrit un célèbre ouvrage sur la fin du travail. Sans doute était-ce prématuré, mais ce que je veux dire par là, c'est que à partir des années 2000, et spécialement à partir des années 2010, la littérature francophone, et en particulier en France, démontre une appétence vis-à-vis du travail tout à fait extraordinaire. Je vais vous donner quelques ouvrages de psychologues, de sociologues, des titres tout à fait formidables, de Yves Leclos, Le travail à cœur, pour en finir avec les risques psychosociaux au travail, de Bernard Stiegler, L'emploi est mort, vive le travail, de Bernard Friot, Émanciper le travail, de Crawford aussi, non francophone, L'éloge du carburant, fabuleux, un essai sur la valeur du travail, ou encore Dominique Méda, très récemment, Réinventer le travail. Il y a donc eu une sorte de frémissement dans les années 90 où certains auteurs, certains chercheurs ont pensé qu'il y avait non seulement un recul, mais peut-être une société sans travail qui se profilait. Et aujourd'hui, il y a un regain en faveur du travail et surtout la mise en évidence de sa valeur centrale pour la société, pour les êtres humains. C'est à la fois une façon pour les êtres humains de se structurer psychologiquement, c'est une façon d'exister sociologiquement dans une société, dans une communauté, et c'est une façon aussi de se libérer. C'est un lieu d'autonomie grâce aux revenus qu'il procure. Donc, vous voyez, on a une évolution très contrastée, et bizarrement, aujourd'hui, où on parle, et déjà ce matin, tant des robots, qui vont détruire massivement le travail, eh bien, du côté de la recherche, on essaye de mettre en évidence encore la nécessité du travail dans nos sociétés. Et sans doute qu'on n'est pas encore à la veille de la fin du travail. Mais en effet, il ne faut jamais oublier, et ceci est une constante, que le travail, c'est quelque chose de très ambivalent, d'intrinsèquement ambivalent. On peut mourir au travail, on peut mourir de travail, mais aussi, comme le disait Albert Camus, on peut mourir par manque de travail. Voilà. Je vais peut-être m'arrêter là pour l'instant.
Let me come to Marcel van der Linden there. As you just heard Professor Daugareilh express so eloquently, you can die from having no work, you can die from work, you can die working, and you can die trying to get work, really. And when it comes to these so-called non-standard forms of labour that really are one of the things that is the elephant in the room when you have conversations about the future of work, where do you see the relationship with society and work and us as individuals and our work change from here? And what will be the consequences of that? I know it's a big question, but it's the existential crisis, to use Albert Camus' La Peste analogy there, that we face today.
Yeah. I think, well, the standard employment relationship about which we talk is a historically exceptional construction. And most of the history of wage labor was the history of casual labor. For those of you who know the Bible, I refer you to Matthew 20, the parable of the vineyard, where the vineyard owner goes to the casual labor market in the morning and picks up some workers, and then after a few hours he goes back, and after a few hours he goes back, and then at the end he says, by the payment, the last shall be the first, and the first shall be, you know this story perhaps. Anyway, this proves that at the time when the New Testament was written, that is about 200 AD, that already wage labor was a quite common phenomenon. But it was casual labor, and probably many of those harvest workers had additional income sources to survive. If they didn't, then their existence, of course, was very miserable. Now, over the course of time, you see that as casual labor increases, and then in the I jump through history. In the 19th century, you see that the better off workers start to organize themselves and to fight for more long-lasting employment relationships, and so, and you get the first mutual aid societies, first unions, and so on. And from this develops in a small part of the world, especially in Europe, later also in Japan and Australia and the United States, you see the growth of standard employment. So one job for a whole week, which suffices to maintain a small family. So there's also a gender aspect here. It's a male breadwinner norm implied. And you have some social security backing you up and some rights to disagree with your employer. Now, this was, as I said, this is something that was valid in Europe and other parts of the developed world for 40, 50 years maybe. So it covered no more than at most 20% of the workers in the world. And now we see the gradual disintegration of this old system of standard employment again. So we see, in a way, a return to the pre-standard relationship, but now we call it differently. And of course, this is an uneven process, and in the more advanced countries, it will be slower and less total in its destructive effects than it will be in other parts of the world. But this is the great challenge. And this challenge, and this is the problem for today, I think, for us, is that at the same time that we have this enormous challenge, so that we can no longer consider the standard employment as the standard, it's the atypical relationship, in fact, that we thought that we could expand the standard employment relationship to the other parts of the world, that now the unions are so weak. Global union density, please remember this, is 7%, according to the ITUC. So 7%, that is not much. And then, of course, our union density in this part of the world is higher. So in a large part of the world, it is lower. So the workers have little bargaining power at the moment to fight for better working conditions.
Well, let's put this to our reactors straight away. Mr. Jennings, it's true that the ILO is part of a tripartite system, but as we heard in our previous sessions earlier today, one of those parties doesn't have the same voice as it used to have. I mean, your reflections on that, and is that partly why we're in this situation, and where does it leave us?
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to see it is more difficult to democratic today than it's been because of the degree of the obstacles that we see. Now, I would hate that people to think this is a natural phenomenon, that we're kind of withering on the vine, that unions haven't got the wherewithal. Not true. We are faced with a situation where half the governments, I think, have still not signed up to 87 and 98 in this House. Give us the access, give us the opportunity, then we can bring workers in and organize them and represent them and do a job. We are a movement of visionaries and dreamers. We were the people 200 years ago that were talking about the 8-hour day, the 8-hour work day, the 8-hour recreation, and 8 hours of sleep. To fix the issues which have emerged, you need a strong, vibrant, independent, and democratic trade union movement. That was the message coming through. I think it was the message that was implied here. And we have the wherewithal, we have the knowledge, we have the capacity to get this job done. And therefore, we hope that this will be one of the messages coming through. You need a partner. We spend our life dealing with the problems that workers have. We see mismanagement. We see irresponsible management. The casualization of labor is no answer to the modern day problems of our societies and communities. There is no point to going back to the docker at the docker gate, getting picked for a piece of work which lasts an hour or 2 hours. Isabelle, we have the digital sans culotte. And we shouldn't be allowed to let this spread any further than it is. There's a place for the union movement. We can contribute. We have the vision, the ideas, but we need the space and the freedom to have access and to organize. We can get the job done.
Do you feel shut out by the digital economy?
No, in terms of whether we shut out, I have more access with more workers, in more working places, in more countries than at any time in my working life. I have WhatsApp applications in 100 different multinational companies. I have shop stewards from Zambia to Tunisia to Detroit to Sydney who are communicating daily. We are using these tools. The problem that we have, and I would cordially invite the Big Five, Google and all the others to a tete-a-tete with Guy Ryder so we can explain to them why the ILO is here, what those labor standards are about, why the working voice should be heard, not just at their swanky head offices, but right down the supply chain. And I think there's a cultural issue and maybe some borrowing some bad examples of anti-union management practices which don't belong. We saw it yesterday with Deliveroo in London. Look, we're not going to be fooled by calling someone that is in employment on a bike or in a taxi that is said he's an independent service provider when he really is an employee. Enough is enough in this regard. The digital world should be open to our ideas, open to the world of dialogue, open to the world of conversation and training and reskilling. And that's why we have a job to do in our movement, is to build those numbers. We can do it. We can bring the people from the new workforce into our membership, and we've shown it worldwide.
Well, Peter Woolford, I just want to ask Peter Woolford from the other side perspective, from the employer's perspective. You've often talked about how essentially crowbarring in expectations into the current institutions where perhaps the digital economy is providing jobs for people who may not otherwise be able to find formal labour, which admittedly some people in this room might find a convenient argument for capitalism. What do you have to say in response there?
I think the immediate clever answer is that Philip is trying to use 20th century tools to deal with the 21st century problem. There will continue to be the majority of workplaces having work that looks like work we've known for the last 100 years. What is occurring today is the new work, the work at the margins, the work where there's growth and change and opportunity does not look like the work we've seen in the past. The employer is disappearing. And as a result, the traditional way of representing workers, the union, is also struggling. So if you look at a platform economy type provider like Upwork or TaskRabbit, Airbnb, who's the employer in that situation? If you don't have an employer, a whole series of things fall out of that. First of all, you don't have anybody who can organize the variety of social programs, who can enforce, as Isabelle and I were talking about before, who can enforce the regulations that we all at the ILO support, because that function doesn't exist anymore. It then means that traditional trade unions don't have an employer they can negotiate with. So I think what we need to think about here as we go forward is that in addition to the structures we've built to serve the 20th century economy, we are going to have to start innovating new types of structures that ensure that in this new world of work, the interests of the individual are served and not the interests of the institutions that we've built in the past. And I say that both on the employer side and on the worker side. It's interesting, Isabelle mentioned the end of work and the end of employment. Those are not the same thing. There will still be work in the world. It may not be done through traditional employment. And by traditional, I include all the non-standard forms of work as well.
What do you think those regulations should be then that could work?
Well, listen, the purpose of those regulations are absolutely still sound and true in the 21st century, and I hope will be true for the future. That is to protect the interests of the individual, to ensure that they live a life in dignity, that they have freedom and security, that they have an adequate income to raise their families, those fundamental rights that we all subscribe to still will exist. But the structures we have used to organize those rights and to ensure they're protected are not serving purpose today. And what we need to do is start to innovate new institutions and new structures to ensure that they are honored. At the same time that we have a world economy that still has a large chunk of people working in a traditional type of structure that we've seen for the last 40, 70, 100 years.
I want to come to Imraan, Valodia here, and also in a second, Thandika and Mkandawire. This is a problem that will be exacerbated in the developing world quite quickly because of the surplus of labour, won't it? And very often, you said that you find in the developing world, some of the problems that are coming up here come up much, much quicker. How concerned are you about the informal nature of work and the progress towards that in a country like South Africa, for instance?
So we've been asked to think about the kind of impact of the changes on work on society. And I think the starting point has to be, what is the society that we're thinking about? I think I can see, to kind of really simplify, two broad kind of groups of societies. I'll sort of call the first one I sort of call the first one the Geneva economy, because I'm here. And one sees a world where you have kind of relatively full employment, where you have secure jobs, where you have high levels of income, where you have kind of social protection systems that are linked up with employment. I see that's one type of reality, and I think we can have the conversation about these issues in that reality. When I go back to Johannesburg, or I go to Mumbai, or I go to Lagos, I see a very different type of reality. I see a labor market that doesn't kind of generate levels of jobs to meet the demand for jobs. So I see massive underemployment. I see we don't talk anymore about the proletariat. We sort of talking about the precariat. So I see large numbers of really precarious kind of jobs. I see kind of social protection systems that have to deal with the reality that you cannot put all of your kind of social sort of policy eggs into the kind of employment basket. And I kind of guess the question for this conversation has to be, which one of those two is the norm, and which one of those two is the exception? So I have to say I found parts of the kind of previous session quite tough to follow, because there was a conversation about whether the trade-off we should be facing is a trade-off between employment and leisure. When I go home to kind of Johannesburg, and I think about that as the trade-off, I have to say I've got to ask myself: are you serious? Are you really serious that that's the trade-off? So for me, I think the labor market that you described, that was largely described in the first session, and the one that I see in Geneva, is very much the exception. The norm is the labor market that I see in Johannesburg, and I think we have to kind of have we've got to have this debate with the norm at the center, rather than the norm as kind of something that we kind of add on in the last two questions. And I think if we're serious about thinking about what are the impacts of the changes on the labor market, we have to confront that reality. There's a second reality which I found which I think we have to think about. I think the kind of reality is that we kind of often think about the kind of issues of work as we're talking about a world that is a male, it's a male world. The idea of kind of jobs that are normal 8-to-5 jobs, the idea of a family structure that we have in our head. Again, when I go back to Johannesburg, I don't see that world. The world of work that I see is largely a female labor market, where large numbers of workers work in the informal economy, work for extremely low levels of income, don't have any social protection, who spend large amounts of their time doing unpaid work. So this kind of idea that the issue is about work and leisure, once more, in that world, I don't see any leisure at all. I see really low incomes, excessively long days, and I think we have to grasp the kind of realities of what is the labor market that we're describing now, and what will the impact of the changes be. I think it's important to take that on, because I think when you start thinking about the labor market in Geneva, the kind of reality is that those of us in the South have been dealing with the problems that are likely to hit you for a long time. So we've been having to think a lot about how do you run an economic system that is not able to generate enough jobs? How do you run a sort of country where you have 30% unemployment? How do you run a sort of country where the tax base that you need for kind of all of the social programs that we need is as small as it is in South Africa? So let me give you one statistic. In South Africa, 2% of all South Africans contribute more than half of sort of personal income taxes. Think about how we've got to manage those challenges in South Africa. I think there's a lot that you can learn in the North about the kinds of challenges that we're having to deal with. So to kind of sum up, I think this reality is kind of really important, but it's important to recognize that those in the North have a lot to learn in this area from those of us in the South, because we've been dealing with this problem for a lot longer than you have. And I'm struck by the fact that in the debates that we have, it's kind of almost assumed that this is a new phenomenon. Well, it's not new. Believe me, come to Johannesburg, I'll show you.
Oh, we'd like to take you up on that offer. Thank you. Professor Mkandawire, I want to ask you about this concept of, a lot of economists have said that there is a big risk here with the change in the nature of formal work, and big international players like, again, Ubers, the Googles, the Airbnbs of the world, also looking at the opportunities that Africa presents, that Africa could end up falling a prey to predatory capitalism if it's unregulated. Would you agree with that statement? And how would that change the nature of work and society across Africa?
Well, first of all, it wouldn't be new. Africa being exploited and regulated by outsiders. It's something we've been living with for many years. I think, just perhaps to put a question to adjust a little bit, we're all talking as if we're all entering this future at different levels of development and different needs and different capacities and so forth. And others are forging ahead towards the frontier, and they have particular problems. Others are just keeping ahead, and then others, like Africa, if they're lucky, they're trying to catch up. And trying to catch up has implications. It means...
Nina, the interpreters can't get the microphone. Maybe it's not turned on.
Your microphone may have fallen off.
We're trying to catch up.
The microphone. You have to take it to the...
Anyway, I was saying that, that we, in a way, the discussion, perhaps Imraan's point, that we're talking about those, I said there was countries which are catching up, others which are forging ahead, and others which are just keeping up. And we spent perhaps much of the discussion has been on those who are on the front, near the frontier, or ahead of, or close to the frontier of the future. And I think the implications for these different levels of development, if you like, should be taken into account. That for countries in Africa, which so-called are catching up, they have to deal with two problems. One is just the what do you call it, disadvantage of being of backwardness, which includes what you might call what Gunnar Myrdal called the backwash effects of the developed countries. For instance, just a simple question: what are you going to do with robots when they collapse? Where are you going to bury them? People say, "Oh, Africa, of course." They will be, we have the space to where you can dump these robots, and so there are these backwash effects that what about? The second one is that, of course, catching up involves learning and of course leapfrogging. If you're doing it well, you learn and you avoid the mistakes of others and so forth. But also it can mean very, very, very costly jumps. We've seen historically the Great Leap Forward, perhaps in China is a classic. So much of the discussion of these developing countries has to deal with this backwardness, so backward, and I use it not in the colonial sense, but in the sense of Geschenkron, of how do countries pick up. And Africa is lagging behind. I'm actually surprised in a sense, by the loss of faith of the West in its own culture and civilization. One of the strong things about the West has been that it had this mastery of technology. And the rest of us have been trying to catch up to the West in technology. And from time to time, this technology has been misused with massive cost at wars and all that. But basically, it's led to a huge transformation of people's lives. And we also know that over the years, from Karl Polanyi and so forth, Western society has been able to generate responses that try to handle some of the alienating effects of technology. And suddenly, the West seems to have lost faith. And I, as an African, I don't want to join that loss of faith. I think what one wants to do from the African point of view, of course, is to learn from the many moments in Western history when technology had been a problem and you have tamed it. And that should be the lesson that I draw from. It would be sad if we were made to believe that there is no hope because there's this thing called robots. It was from the West that we were taught that you should not adopt the attitude towards your technology, the same attitude as the primitives have towards fetish. That don't fetishize technology. It's your creation. You can control it. And I think that's the message I would like to, and for Africa is young. Africa is a very, very young continent. And I think quite open in terms of its evaluation of, when the West talks about Africa, this is about labor. In the last 10 years especially, when they've been talking about Africa rising, they have talked about African labor, not as labor that will produce things for Africa, but as labor that will solve the European problems of aging and so forth, and as consumers. That, of course, will lead to the problems we've had in Africa historically, where labor has been taken from Africa to work in the plantations elsewhere. if we, however, think of African labor reserves that we have today, which are huge, for the development of Africa, then we have to not be afraid of technology, but find ways of where, and I think it's what Chinese are probably doing, was walking on two legs, having robotics on one hand to create these surplus generating industries and to create an industry that are job generating. It is a pity in many ways that, and that's Imraan's point, a number of the headaches that the workers are having in the developed countries were experiments carried out in the South, okay, that you could develop rapidly by weakening workers. Okay. It's been done, but and there were a lot of theories why that was a good thing. That labor in third world was prematurely unionized, and you must suppress them and attract capital to attract capital. Until a few years ago, I think the World Bank used to include in its indicators of doing business they used to include the ability to fire and hire. That was a good indicator, and I think the ILO protested about that. The point that lots of the bad things that you may be suffering from due to technologies have been incorporated in the thinking about labor in the third world, and encourage governments that if you want to attract investors, if you want to, to be a destination for whatever it is, you have to do things that make labor, quotation mark, flexible, which means hiring and firing. And so there is a basis for, once again, hopefully, for a new conversation between the developing countries who have seen this before, who have been told this was a good thing, and with the North that is beginning to see that this is a terrible thing.
Marcel van der Linden, let me start out by taking some questions from the audience in Slido. Now, Marcel van der Linden, it strikes me as though this would be a good one for you. One of our members of the audience has said, how can rights to training and development be adjusted to a future with diverse forms of work avoiding discrimination of flexible workers here? So,
wow, that's a big question. Well, maybe we should start, how the future will look like. And let me say a few words about it because I disagree with...
I'm surprised.
I don't think that people in the future will have no employers anymore. There will, of course, be self-employed people also. But what we see is, and we should not forget, by the way, that maybe the majority of the work is in agriculture and that kind of sectors where all these discussions are not so immediately relevant. But that what we see is that the classical firm, which was the basis also for unions and so, was necessary, as we know from Ronald Coase and that kind of economists, because the transaction costs could be lowered by having all the workers under one roof. Now that transaction costs can be lowered through new communication devices and internet and what have you, the traditional firm is a bit disintegrating, is becoming decentralized, which means that people look as if they are more or less autonomous, but they're still within the network of the firm. And all the things about professional training and vocational training and so should be seen in that light. That what is very important, I think, as a primary task of training, apart from the really professional training, is to learn to see through these complicated new structures. And apparently we here ourselves do not yet do this. So this is a gigantic task. But it could be one of the main tasks also of the educational program of the ILO, I think.
Let me ask Isabelle Daugareilh quickly to respond on that first, and then I'll take questions from both of you. Isabelle, s'il vous plaît.
Rapidement, je ne sais pas. Je voudrais juste dire quelque chose sur la technologie et le progrès technique. Il ne faudrait pas quand même qu'on sorte de cette salle en jetant à la poubelle le progrès technique. Ça serait fort malheureux, à mon avis. Et je crois qu'il est important quand même de rappeler toute l'ambivalence du progrès technique, c'est-à-dire ses bienfaits et ses méfaits. Je prendrai l'exemple français des porteurs d'eau du XXe siècle, début du XXe siècle, qui étaient au nombre de 15 000 et dont le métier a complètement disparu parce qu'on a introduit les canalisations souterraines dans la ville de Paris. Eh bien, je crois qu'aujourd'hui, personne ne regrette la disparition de ce métier des porteurs d'eau qui était quand même plutôt pénible. Donc le progrès technique a servi quand même aussi à réduire la pénibilité au travail et ça va sans doute continuer à servir à avoir cette fonction-là. Donc, il faut, je crois, le rappeler. Il faudrait également rappeler que le progrès technique, ça sert à augmenter les performances dans le travail. Songeons aux robots dans la médecine, dans la chirurgie, ça permet aux chirurgiens d'avoir une précision inégalée. Donc, c'est aussi un autre bienfait. Et puis, et là, je vais sans doute d'abord provoquer l'ire de la salle, la technologie et les téléphones portables et autres, peut et a déjà un bienfait, aussi des méfaits, mais a un bienfait, y compris dans des pays industrialisés et développés, comme la France par exemple, ou l'Allemagne ou autres. On sait que les chauffeurs Uber sont souvent des jeunes gens ou des jeunes femmes qui viennent de milieux très défavorisés, qui subissent l'exclusion sociale dans tous les sens du terme, et qui, pour employer une parole triviale que l'on peut trouver lorsqu'on les interviewe, disent que c'est plus facile de trouver un client grâce à Uber qu'un employeur. Et donc je crois que ça aussi c'est important, c'est de voir que le progrès technique, ça peut aussi, et celui-là en particulier, servir à des processus d'insertion sociale. La question est pas tellement le progrès technique en soi ou la technologie en soi, c'est surtout comment on introduit ce progrès-là et cette technologie-là? Avec quels moyens? On introduit des robots ou on introduit des nouvelles techniques d'information et de communication dans les entreprises. Je crois que dans les entreprises qui existent toujours quand même aujourd'hui, dans certains pays, la plupart, il y a des organisations syndicales, il y a des institutions représentatives du personnel, et dans certains pays, ces dernières ont pour compétence juridique de discuter avec l'employeur sur les conditions d'introduction de ces nouvelles technologies. Et bien évidemment, par-delà, de discuter sans doute aussi de plans de formation, de la mise en œuvre d'un droit à la formation pour que les travailleurs soient adaptés à cette nouvelle technologie et qu'ils puissent être très mobiles et très habiles avec ces nouvelles technologies. Donc je crois qu'il faut quand même faire très attention à ne pas jeter le bébé avec l'eau du bain. En matière de technologie. Et puis je voudrais dire aussi une deuxième chose, et ça c'est quelque chose qui commence à apparaître en tout cas dans notre monde académique. Nous sommes en train d'ouvrir, en tout cas les juristes et les juristes de droit social, un dialogue épistémologique, éthique, avec les créateurs de ces nouvelles technologies. Tout simplement peut-être pour raviver ce qu'a si bien dit le philosophe « Science sans conscience n'est que ruine de l'âme ». Si nous avons conscience que le travail a une place centrale et a un sens profond pour l'être humain, eh bien alors cette conscience-là doit nous conduire à nous rapprocher des sciences et techniques pour discuter de quelle est la place dans ces objets, dans ces nouveaux outils de travail de l'être humain. Pas plus tard qu'hier, je discutais avec un professeur de robotique et il était ravi de ma démarche à son égard parce que, en effet, il ne veut pas, en tant que chercheur, en tant que scientifique, aller contre les hommes, aller contre le travail. Et donc, on a à côté des robots maintenant des cobots qui sont... voilà. Bref, ce qui est important, c'est, je crois, d'avoir un propos peut-être mesuré, d'être extrêmement vigilant et de considérer que nous disposons déjà d'outils, d'organisations qui permettent d'apprivoiser un petit peu et peut-être de maîtriser les effets négatifs de ces technologies.
Let me just ask Peter Woolford to respond to that, actually, because what was really interesting about what Isabelle was saying there is that the situation we have at the moment is that inequality is particularly high. And so, as you were pointing out, Isabelle, we have this issue of high inequality at the same time when we have unsure futures for people in terms of the formality of their nature of employment with their employer.
That's one of the challenges I think we are wrestling with, because we have traditionally used, I take the professor's point about Geneva and Johannesburg. In the developed market economies, what we have used as our principal organizing tool is the employment relationship. And so we expect financing to be done through the employment relationship. We expect compliance with regulations to be done through employment relationship. We expect the individual protections that a worker rightly expects in the workplace to be done through an employment relationship. And when that starts to change on us, then all of that structure that we have invented doesn't work as well. And so the point I was trying to make in my first intervention is that we are going to have to find ways of providing those protections in a new environment. I think the second point that Isabelle's coming at is the whole question of whether there will be enough work for people to do. And in Lord Skidelsky's taxonomy this morning, I guess I'm an optimist. I think we have seen through history that humans have always had the chance, have always found ways of finding work. Somebody mentioned on our panel that agriculture will continue to be a major employer. In Canada, it used to employ well over 50% of our population. Today, it's less than 1%. It's less than 1%. So what's happened is all those people lost their jobs? No, they didn't. Individuals decided to go to where there was new opportunity and new chances for work. And I think we'll see the same process happen here. People are very creative. They will find work. Work will emerge. The problem for us as people who think about this in policy terms is that work will not look like what we conceive of as work. It will still be human activity for pay, but it will not be in many of the traditional structures that we expect to see. That has enormous implications for how our society is operated and how we fund and enforce the rules that we believe a civilized society should have. The second thing then is that as these new forms of work emerge, as new opportunities for work emerge, individuals will have a chance to get the benefits of society without necessarily paying their fair share. And that's a taxation problem, which I think has been touched on by some speakers. And we're going to have to deal with that as well. And traditionally, where we've used employment relationship to do that, we can't use that today.
You said individuals, but
yes.
Isn't the reality is it's companies providing platforms who won't necessarily.
But you see, in the future, I don't think we're going to have as many companies providing the incremental jobs and work that we expect. I think it will come through other forms. TaskRabbit is not an employer. Airbnb is not an employer. And if we somehow find a clever way of pretending that they're an employer so they will be responsible, some other creative human being will come along and invent another structure which escapes that. That's the dynamic I think we're into today. And so instead of trying to pretend that somehow we can force new innovations back into a mold that the Western world developed in the 30s and 40s and 50s, we're going to have to find something new.
Philip Jennings, a response to that.
Thank you. Well, I don't buy this dystopian view from Philip, quite frankly, because he's talking about a melting world, a disintegrating world, a world of the lone hunter business person, the lone hunter digital hacker. But if you look at the way economic power is distributed today, I just put the question back to you. We have never had this level of concentration of economic and business power over a new raw material, data. 6 companies govern this data universe. 6 companies have the channels, the bridges, the power. They set the new rules of the game. This is nothing about a disintegration of economic and business power. It's a consolidation of it. It's a concentration of it. And I know you don't like to harp back to the past, but if Adam Smith was alive, he would see this as a conspiracy, as he did then. So those basic rules that applied about the danger of concentration, the danger of abuse, still apply. Now, please, we organize people in the new areas of work. Don't think for a minute that the trade union movement can't represent freelance workers. The most highly organized part of the American economy today, given the public sector, still 37%, is in the field of the creative and media industry. We have the most creative people, the writers, the film directors, the actors, the musicians, the technicians, all those people in the digital world. Yes, self-employed, but within a framework of fairness and justice to maintain standards. The Directors Guild still has a rule called Global One, that this agreement will apply wherever a particular task is being undertaken. I'm sure in the room we have the World Employment Conference that deal with temporary employment agencies. They will say how stubborn, how this model you're talking about, that full-time employment is still the model. There's a growth in self-employment, yes, but in the world of part-time work and temporary agency, this House showed its relevance with an ILO convention, a convention which set the rules of the game about licensing, about fair play, about registration, and about paying the rates for the game. And within Europe, we have European Union legislation. Now, it's not a big leap to go from a digital hacker or a digital platform worker into that kind of universe. Now, they're very, very clever. I mean, Uber has employed the best political lobbyists. I was stunned. I'm there talking about the future of Uber and the gig economy. David Plouffe is sitting next to me, and he was the guy that won the Obama race in 2008. Then I go along to Davos and I meet someone from the UK. I used to work with David Cameron. Then Nellie Cruz rolls up. Please, I mean, I know there's a lot of good things said about this, but this is also a political operation to deregulate and to try and set a new terms of reference. Also, a history lesson on the trade union side. Before there were factories, there were tradesmen, there were masons, there were skilled tradespeople, itinerant workers. That's where the labor movement started. And that's where they formed collectives. That's why when you go to your pub in London, Philip, look out for the Carpenters' Arms. You're in a pub where the carpenters came together and set up a union, and so on. So what I'm talking about, this disintegration of power is not real, that there are ways and tools that we can use. What was the best economic period that we can talk about? Post-war. Because we had labor market institutions. We had a sense of responsibility in the business community that we were in this together. The birth of this house was because of war and exploitation and the fact that people didn't feel a sense of belonging. Therefore, there's lessons to be learned from this, and that's why the ILO centenary in the 2019 gives a chance for the ILO to have this kind of renaissance and say, look, the wealth will be, no one is saying that wealth is not going to be created. I haven't had one comment that the wealth is not being recreated. Deloitte had just put a report out saying there's going to be $2, $4, $5 trillion added to the world economy. That takes us back to the question of distribution, and that's where we fit in. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the Jennings and Passion speech. I want to take a question from the Ambassador of Panama, Mr. Ambassador Cesar Gomez, who I believe has a question for us. Is that right?
Muchas gracias. Voy a hablar en idioma para darle uso a los intérpretes. Bueno, primero que todo, yo estoy sumamente complacido de estar aquí, de lo que he escuchado toda esta mañana. Quiero felicitar al director general por esta iniciativa, especialmente unas palabras que dijo el director general esta mañana que no debemos olvidar, cuando mencionó que ojalá, y lo dijo de otra manera, pero que ojalá dejáramos de teorizar tanto la situación del mundo y fuéramos a la acción, fuéramos a que el resultado de estos 2 días fueran propuestas concretas que puedan crear un impacto en el futuro real del trabajo. Y eso quiero felicitarle al director, a todo su equipo por esta iniciativa, a la directora adjunta Débora Winfield por todo su esfuerzo, porque esto, y muy especialmente al señor Jefferson por haber creado y que hoy se esté dando esta situación. Quiero darle las gracias a eso. He escuchado en esta mañana planteamientos de todo tipo y concluyo sobre todo en la primera parte cuando Lord Silkins nos hablaba, y he planteado algunos elementos importantes sobre el ser humano, porque el futuro del trabajo tiene que ver con el ser humano, porque el que trabaja es el ser humano, porque si hablábamos de robots, entonces no estamos hablando de un futuro, sino del futuro de los robots. Y el ser humano busca un sentido de pertenencia, lo vi esta mañana y lo repitieron varias veces, y hoy acabo de escuchar un planteamiento aquí muy interesante de parte de la presentación de don Jennings, muy emotiva, muy entusiasta, sobre el movimiento sindical, y tiene razón en todo lo que ha planteado. Pero también he visto un planteamiento positivo de los empleadores que tienen una visión de futuro, porque saben que el empleo lo generan ellos, los gobiernos nada más regulamos cosas, y saben que de ellos depende que se creen nuevos empleos, así que de ellos depende también el futuro, de estos empleadores serios, sanos, decentes, que buscan el trabajo decente para sus trabajadores, porque eso los permite lucrar. También me he dado cuenta que hemos hablado que el sentido de realización, el ser humano busca un sentido de realización. Y por eso cuando el distinguido doctor Mkandawire de África nos hablaba de estar viendo los ejemplos de estas otras economías y qué pasa, y he visto que en el foro pues hay de todas las regiones, excepto la nuestra, de América Latina y el Caribe, cosa que a lo mejor me permite hacerles preguntas de cómo nos ven ustedes a nosotros. Porque es muy bueno, como usted planteó, ver los puntos de vista de los ejemplos de las regiones que ya han pasado por esta curva de aprendizaje para no cometer los mismos errores. Pero también desde el punto de vista de tener un sentido de que yo soy responsable, nuestra región es responsable de sus propias decisiones y no tratar a veces de meternos en un modelo que a veces no encaja porque nuestras culturas y nuestras idiosincrasias son un poquito diferentes. También esta mañana hablaban de la publicidad y el consumismo insaciable, y eso me llamó la atención. Y cuando uno de ustedes comentó sobre los celulares en la sala y la tecnología, me hizo ver que es cierto. O sea, la tecnología tiene varias ramas y en la comunicación ha sido excelente. Ha facilitado la comunicación entre empresarios y trabajadores, dentro del trabajo de los gremios, en la medicina y demás. Pero hay otra tecnología de avanzada que está desplazando fuentes de trabajo. Y la robótica, con esta producción en serie exagerada para suplir ciertos mercados, y el excedente vienen y nos los, como el término técnico, nos los dompean hacia América Latina, y eso crea un desplazamiento, y esa masa laboral se va ¿a dónde? A los países industrializados, Estados Unidos, Europa, buscando. Entonces es un ciclo cerrado de nunca acabar, y muy especialmente se nos van nuestros talentos. Se nos van estos profesores universitarios, estos grandes economistas, estos grandes médicos latinoamericanos, estos grandes ingenieros latinoamericanos, porque no hay en nuestros países una respuesta positiva para toda su capacidad creativa. Y antes ustedes hablaron de la capacidad creativa, que eso es el futuro. Entonces, yo me pregunto, ¿qué vamos a hacer con todo esto? ¿Qué vamos a hacer? ¿Cómo puede América Latina y el Caribe surgir dentro de este futuro que ustedes lo han enmarcado muy bien? Han hecho una fotografía del mundo, pero desde la perspectiva del África, de Sudáfrica, en la mañana de Inglaterra, de Francia, de los empleadores. ¿Cómo está América Latina en todo eso? Porque lo que sí he notado es que la producción de alimentos en un momento dado va a depender de América Latina. El resto del mundo va a comer de lo que se produce en América Latina. Y muchos de los trabajadores, aquí mismo en Ginebra, que es la utopía ideal que usted presentó antes muy bien, muchos de los trabajadores, la mano de obra no calificada de la industria de la construcción en este país, he notado que viene de América Latina, muy especialmente de Sudamérica. Por consiguiente, eso es un fenómeno que tenemos que analizar y ver profundamente. El mundo marítimo, la tecnología está empezando ya a desplazar las cuadrillas de marinos y va a llegar un momento en que los barcos van a ser autónomos. ¿Qué vamos a hacer con todas esas personas? Muy especialmente con los jóvenes menores de 35 años que en nuestra región se van a enfrentar con los desastres naturales y que quieren participar y ayudar y destruyen las economías de estos desastres naturales y no estamos entrenados para ayudar. Y también hay un modelo que ayer pude participar, escuchar unas disertaciones sobre cooperativismo y nos presentaban unos ejemplos muy importantes, satisfactorios. Me encantaron de Italia y de otras regiones, Suecia, Finlandia. Yo estuve en Finlandia en la década del 97 y son países que el cooperativismo ha permitido llenar todos estos vacíos. ¿Cómo está el desarrollo cooperativo desde el punto de vista de la OIT y desde el punto de vista de ustedes para América Latina? Porque nosotros nada más lo vemos como ahorro y crédito, pero las cooperativas de servicio son una especie de sindicato y a la vez son una empresa. Entonces, todo esto pueden ser los modelos del futuro del trabajo que decíamos. ¿Cómo podemos nosotros resolver todo esto que ustedes han dicho para la América Latina y el Caribe? Muchas gracias, Panellists.
Thank you. Ambassador, thank you very much for that. Well, there seems to be three in particular key questions coming from that. So let's start out with you, Imraan, Valodia. How can other emerging markets like Latin America, as the ambassador was saying there, learn from the kind of examples that you were warning everybody about in this room to make sure that they're in control of their own destiny? If you take that question first.
I think we have a lot to learn from some of the issues that you're dealing with in your sort of part of the world. And I think for me, the most important lesson that I take from your sort of part of the world is the way you've been dealing with inequality. I think we can probably all agree that that at least for the short to the medium term, I think the kind of changes that we're likely to see in the labor market are probably going to increase inequality. I think Thomas sort of Piketty's work is really helpful to get us to think about the inequality issue. The main point he makes is that if the rate of return to sort of capital is rising faster than the growth rate, then you're going to get massive increases in inequality. And I think if we try to predict what's likely to happen with kind of automation, kind of robots, I think we can probably all say definitely that the rate of return to capital is going to go up. It simply has to, by the way you define it. The real question is whether economic growth is going to grow faster than what the returns to sort of capital are. I don't think so. So I think we're going to see kind of increases in massive increases in inequality. I think we're going to see a lot of the rich being much richer, and I think the Latin American countries are probably ahead of the curve in thinking about how you deal with inequality. So from the perspective of South Africa, where we've kind of had to deal with massive growth in inequality in the post-apartheid period, we've learned a lot from the way Brazil, for example, has dealt with it. So the kind of Brazilian example, I think, is starting to unravel, but I think there's still some really interesting lessons about the way the Brazilians dealt with the redistribution of income from the sort of capitalist class to the workers, and the way that then generates economic growth. And I think we kind of really need to talk a lot more about the examples in your sort of part of the world. Can I use the space to raise another macroeconomic issue? I think we often think about this problem, and for much of the way we've kind of spoken about it up to now, we're thinking primarily about the supply side of the economy. We're thinking about the kind of impacts on work. Are we thinking about changes in the labor market? I think we have to start to match that with some thinking on the demand side of the economy. So we can drive down the price of manufactured goods, all sorts of things with kind of changes in technology. I think the kind of reality is that unless there's somebody there to buy those goods, that's not going to help us too much. So we kind of have to think about the demand side of the economy, and kind of here I kind of strongly agree with the kind of arguments for a basic income grant. I mean, it just seems to me that starts to confront some of the issues on the demand side, and unless we have a large enough consumer sort of base, I think we kind of going to have increasingly fractured economies where a kind of really small group of kind of really high income people are the sole group that are kind of buying goods. I mean, it's, you know, that might make sense here, but in much of Africa, in much of the developing world, I think this kind of idea about unsatiable kind of demand doesn't really hold. I mean, most of the population in the developing world, I think, are still kind of needing to sort of get to a standard of living that I think we would all think about as acceptable. So, you know, basic infrastructure, basic food, kind of social services such as education. So there's still a long way to go on those issues, and I think the sort of basic income grant idea starts to deal with a whole set of those problems.
Do you think it'll ever be implemented, though? I mean, for instance, you're on the committee setting the national minimum wage, which is going to be introduced in South Africa in a year or two's time. How will these tools help to really have a material effect on people? And the relationship of, you know, the decent jobs that they want as well. It's not just having a job, it's having a decent job.
So
that pays enough.
One could take a really kind of pessimistic view and say, you know, the sort of basic income grant is that it's a fantastic idea, but it's unlikely to have any serious traction in the sort of policy part of the economy. Well, if you stepped into South Africa in the early 90s and you suggested the idea of a national minimum wage, I think you would probably have concluded that it's unlikely to have any traction in the among the employers, among much of the state. That kind of reality has changed. I kind of think for our society in South Africa, when you start to look at the sort of data that we have on pay scales, on the large numbers of workers who earn kind of really, really low incomes, on the massive growth that we've had in inequality, I think all of that sort of data starts to speak for itself. And I think you then have to think about creative ways in which you solve those problems. And we're now going to have a national minimum wage. It's going to be implemented in the new year. And I think it will start to address some of the inequality challenges that we have in South Africa. I think similarly, it's likely to be the case that the ideas on a sort of basic income grant will start to have traction once we confront the realities of what the world of work might be like in the future.
Philip Jennings, you wanted to make a question?
We talk about inclusive growth, of course, but there's also the inclusive dimension of what this digital revolution is all about. And if I'm correct, more than half of humanity is still not connected to the internet. And I know in Africa there are, because we represent workers in the IT and telecoms field, there are something like 600 million people with mobile phones. But there's double that number, I think, that don't have a proper address, that there's no address. So we are working with the Union of Postal Unions to try and have it, to develop a situation where people who don't have any address whatsoever have some form of address, which begins a part of the formal part of communication around which you can build hubs of enterprise and hubs of activity. So I think this, as our friend from Panama mentioned, His Excellency the Ambassador, there is this still the need to connect. There's a need for infrastructure, and there's a need for the citizens in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere that they have this right of connectivity. With respect to their economies, we represent workers in the services side. The services industries in many of these countries are very primitive. And when you look at retail distribution and transport and elsewhere, the job opportunities are frankly limitless in that regard. If you look at Europe, in many parts of the private sector, 1 in 8 jobs are to be found in the retail side. It's plateauing. So I would say the services industry needs to be looked at. The diversification of the economies, it's not the future for Africa to be the exploiter of the raw materials, the diamonds on the soles of the shoes of the population. There has to be a need of diversification, and perhaps there's a chance of leapfrogging progress in terms of the technical ability. The possibilities of solar energy are I think, very, very promising. And therefore, we kind of look with hope and optimism in this regard, that there are possibilities, that there are choices to be made, and if we get this infrastructure right, then we can have more global connectivity. When it comes to distribution, I'm really glad that there is a collective bargaining in South Africa, of course. Some workers fall through the net, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's correct that someone that works in one of the supermarkets where there is a union will have to work 1,200 years to earn what the CEO earns in 1 year. Now, this is not a model for the future. Now, I know the politicians are grasping with this. I know that Peter Drucker, the management guru, felt that if this ratio went from beyond 20 to 25 to 40 to 1, there was already a difficulty. And I'm very interested watching the parliamentary debates in France the other night. The biggest round of applause came when Mr. Mélenchon, seems to be a very reasonable candidate to many in the room, he got the biggest round of applause when he said we should tax people who earn that kind of money 100%. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to be considered by Guy Ryder's Global Commission, but it does rather show into sharp relief the problems that we have of distribution today. And that's why this urgency of trying to find, we use the sense of just transition, adaptation, mitigation, but above all, responsibility. Thank you.
It's a very extreme argument, but Marcel van der Linden, you wanted to make
briefly.
a point.
I wanted to say that maybe we are focusing too much now on robotization and so. And because I think this is something that touches now about 5% of the world labor force, and that we should also pay attention to other important developments, like, for instance, this whole trend towards arm's length production, where Hennes and Mauritz, or whatever you hear in Europe or North America, do not have foreign direct investment, but have other firms in the global south producing the stuff in commission, so they are not formally the employers. So there again, you have a case of the invisible or indirect employer, and that is, I think, is the major trend which we should confront. And in that respect also, about collective bargaining, I think one of the reasons why the trade union movement on a global scale is now so weak and is becoming weaker is because it's so fixated on collective bargaining. But if you, for instance, in India, where 92% of the working population is in the informal sector, where they change jobs every few days, collective bargaining doesn't work. You need other creative solutions to build a trade union movement under these circumstances. And that is something that I still miss in the international union movement, is thinking about that.
Come and spend a couple of days with me.
Sure.
Just come and spend a couple of days with me. Come on a trip with me, and we'll talk to workers in these places, and we'll say to them, why aren't you a member of a union? Teleperformance, French company, has hundreds of thousands of employees. They're going into new places. They have a handful of people in France and maybe up to 300,000 outside. Why would Teleperformance dismiss the shop steward because he was trying to organize workers in a call center in the Dominican Republic?
Sure.
We pick this information up. We see this happening all of the time. This is not a natural process that we're seeing. In some areas, it's extremely political. In others, it's not seen. You know, if you're recognizing a union, you don't get your MBA from Harvard University anymore. But the fact of the matter is, when this bit of the equation is weakened, outcomes are problematic in terms of business, in terms of economic vitality, and also, as Guy mentioned this morning, some of the rather difficult political consequences that we see when people feel there's no one talking for them, listening to them, or acting for them.
That's not my problem. My problem is that there are other solutions that we can learn from history. For instance, unions often developed from friendly societies, mutual aid societies, and so. And for instance, many of the self-employed now organize spontaneously their mutual aid societies for in case of sickness and so that they can have some support. And I think one of the tasks of the union movement would be to help this kind of very primitive organization as the first step to further development.
It's partly that, and I also want to bring in the question here at the top of, as you can see, this Slido chart that's the most popular in the room at the moment. Philip, Jennings, this is one to you. Unions tend to speak for those already in work. They protect the status quo. Are unions therefore the right partners then to talk about the future of work? I mean, you addressed this partly with the informal workers, but the reality is that we also need to consider employment and the other side of employment, which is unemployment and trying to find a job.
We are the champions of employment opportunities for all. We are the champions of decent work for all. We are the champions for universal health care. We are the champions of universal access to education. We want access for all students that they can go to college and their parents will not be penalized heavily economically for this. All our history is about clear values of community and of society. And yes, of course, we represent people in workplaces. We stand up for them. We are a voice for them. But this is a very, I would say, a very unfair interpretation of the historical role that we have played and will continue to play. When we come to this House, we talk about international labor standards. The answer is here, in this House. When you look at the scope of the standards that they have, perhaps one day we can have a scenario of global bargaining here, in this room. Are the transport workers in the room? We have a global convention for maritime, which looks at working conditions, which looks at wages. Now, and this is probably the pinnacle of the achievement in terms of getting decent work. We are about those universal values of equality and justice and democracy and organization, and this kind of interpretation that puts us in there as selfish, greedy individuals only interested in taking care of a small part of the workforce is flat wrong. Thank you.
Peter Walcroft, though, you say the market will provide. It won't provide for everybody, and it might not provide what they need or want.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to get away from being an organizing committee here. I would like to take it in a slightly different direction. I think what I'm hearing here is really three parts of the challenge that we're facing. The first is income distribution. First is ensuring that individuals have adequate income to live a decent life. I don't think anybody who's part of the ILO or in this room would debate that. But that's a problem that we have to solve. That is dealing, I'm an old finance department creature, so it's a tax problem. Those are technical problems that I think we can solve. But income distribution is one issue. The second then is around what I would call workers' rights in the workplace, ensuring, as Philip just said, decent work. That's a second set of issues that we'll have to deal with. And as the way work is done in ways that we have not seen in the past, we are going to have to reconceive of what those rights are, and we're going to have to ensure that they're respected in different ways. We've relied on employers in the past to essentially manage that, and we may not be able to do that in the future. That's the second package of issues. The third package, which I don't think we've only touched on, and I think interestingly it's been people representing developing countries who've touched on this, and that is the role of work in terms of social validation. that when you meet somebody and you ask them what they do, they tell you what their work is. And we get value for that. Philip and I were talking about this before the session. He's not standing for re-election next year, but he doesn't intend to just go away and do nothing. He will be still busy, he will still be working, he just won't be paid for it. And so I think that the third issue that we're going to have to deal with, and I'm in the same situation. Je suis dans la même position.
Thank you very much, Philip. I appreciate this act of charity towards me on your behalf.
But I told him to come on over. I've been retired for 8 years. I'm still busy, I'm just not getting paid for it. And so one of the things society is going to have to do is reconceive of what work is and how work and leisure, work and social obligations fit together into a package. So part of it may be in an employment relationship, part of it may be paid work that's not in an employment relationship, part of it may be work that you don't get paid for, or you may get paid in different ways. And that third dimension, I don't think we have really got our hands around at all. That's a very different challenge that we're going to face. It transcends a lot of what we're talking about here. So, deal with the income issues, deal with the workplace issues. The third one is the position of the individual in society and how we've attached that to employment in the past.
I'm just going to read you a comment that's come through on Slido, as you can see here, quote, "As long as ILO employers' representatives continue to ferociously resist anything other than enterprise-level bargaining, no real progress is possible." Professor Mkandawire,
can I just respond to that for a minute?
Please.
This is not about enterprise-level bargaining. That's not what we're here for. This is not an organizing committee, folks. The issues are a little bigger than giving unions organizing rights. Enough said.
Duly noted. Let's make sure we get quite a few of the other comments in here. Should we have, Professor Mkandawire, should we have stronger international institutions that can really regulate the borders that are blurred? That's something that somebody in the audience is also keen to know. What do you think? Given
well, I don't think it's only a question of institutions. I mean, the success of the welfare state in Europe had an underlying principle of solidarity. And we have not been able to replicate that solidarity on a global scale. So that just creating institutions is not enough. There has to be a moral basis for that, and the moral basis for that used to be solidarity. And I don't see that much of that today, and therefore, probably it's the moral basis that must precede the institutions. That if there was solidarity in the world, we wouldn't worry about the surpluses produced by robots. There are so many people who would receive those goods. They'd be very happy to have the goods produced. The surpluses are really a reflection of a very narrow market based in a very narrow part of the world, and they don't know what to do with the surplus that these machines can produce. And so, and I think, in a sense, our debate has been perhaps, I think, so the big elephant in this room has been that we are talking about a capitalist system in which what matters is not needs but demand, and demand is only effective demand when there is money. If there's no money, it's just needs. We have needs in Africa, but we don't constitute a demand. I was intrigued to hear that the capitalist, the employer is withering away. I thought our big struggles are the withering away of the state, but now I've heard now the labor is withering away and the business is withering away, and the state is also withering away. And this is like a fantastic world. I mean, where we're going. We are reaching something which the anarchists dreamt of for years.
Well, actually, that brings me to a question somebody from the room who's described themselves as Peaceful Future has also asked. If people work less hours in the future, what can we do to ensure that they evolve themselves in constructive matters versus destructive ones, which is kind of to your point as well?
Look, I mean, there's an interesting thing going on in universities now. People talk a lot about making universities more teach, sort of produce kind of a productivist view of the university, you know, training people for the market to produce more. But very little is said about training people for, if you like, for leisure, for life. We know how to, and we know that a lot of stuff that we enjoy in our private life is not natural. We are taught to enjoy these things. We are taught to read. You're taught, you're taught to go to opera. You're taught. These cultural activities are not, as I said, not given. And there's no reason why we should not invest more, if we think people have more time, in changing our universities, our schooling system, to allocate more time to things that people do when they have free time. I mean, I think that unfortunately, this is a contradiction between the university world, where the pressure on the universities is productivist. And yet at the same time we're worrying about what will people do in their spare time. There ought to be some kind of thinking about how about a consumptionist focus of the universities. Consumption not in terms of material, but just in terms of education and reading and science and enjoying the massive, cultural and scientific, legacies that we have inherited as, from earlier periods.
Professor Daugareilh, you want to make a point, and I also want to point out that somebody in the audience has asked you a specific question, which I'd also like you to tackle as well. We're now in the age of disruptive digital transformations of work, as we've established during a lengthy part of our debate. What shall be done with the outdated work standards, rules, regulations, and laws? And you're obviously an employment specialist, lawyer specialist as well, aren't you? So what's your personal view on that?
Bon, vous tombez mal là, parce que ce propos de l'obsolescence, de la désuétude du droit du travail, voire du droit du travail comme une frontière invisible qui empêcherait les échanges économiques, la mondialisation, la globalisation, etc., je n'adhère pas à ce propos qui est un propos purement idéologique et sans doute faux. Ce que je voudrais, c'est revenir sur la place du droit et que peut faire le droit. Ah, j'ai plus le micro. Oui, sur la place du droit et que peut faire le droit face à la pénurie de travail ou aux transformations profondes du travail et des organisations. Sachant que, et ça il faut le garder en tête aussi, que le droit c'est pas quelque chose d'abstrait, c'est le résultat d'un compromis social et politique, et ça peut même être parfois des volontés politiques avant-gardistes qui sont consacrées juridiquement. Alors on a beaucoup parlé ce matin du revenu de base universel. C'est une idée qui, vous le savez, est soutenue par un candidat à la présidentielle en France et ça ne lui sert pas beaucoup. Il est pour l'instant marginalisé sur cette idée. Chacun considère en effet que c'est une idée, une utopie, et sans doute qu'il faut examiner cette idée-là. Mais il me semble que, avant de mettre en œuvre cette idée, il me semble que nous avons quelques moyens encore de répondre aux défis qui nous sont posés. Et que je voudrais exposer ici, et des moyens qu'on peut trouver en ressources dans notre droit, dans des principes généraux dont nous disposons ici ou là et que parfois nous partageons universellement. Il faudrait peut-être faire la publicité, la pub de Keynes et dire que voilà, ce n'est pas Marx, ce n'est pas un révolutionnaire, et pourtant il a prédit que moins d'heures seraient nécessaires pour avoir autant, voire plus de productivité en 2015. Alors ça, c'est tout à fait étrange parce que dans le débat, la réduction de la durée du travail, qui est une histoire ancienne, qui est la genèse même du droit du travail, est complètement absente du débat et même est une sorte de monstre, de terreur. On sait en France que les 35 heures, ça soulève encore beaucoup de passion. Il n'empêche qu'il y avait une autre auteure, qui était Dominique Tadei, qui avait défendu une idée qui me semble au cœur de la solution, des solutions que nous pourrions proposer, qui est celle du partage du travail. Puisque, en effet, il va se réduire, on ne sait pas dans quelle proportion, et il faudrait repenser et remettre au goût du jour cette théorie-là, quitte ensuite à la concrétiser de diverses façons. Étant entendu, évidemment, que s'il s'agit de réduire la durée du travail pour ouvrir un espace pour les loisirs, la vie personnelle, etc., il faut évidemment avoir un maintien des revenus, sinon ça ne sert strictement à rien. Mais je voudrais aussi dire qu'il y a des expériences, et ça me semble extrêmement important d'en parler ici, des expériences à des échelons beaucoup moins élevés que le monde, ou beaucoup moins élevés que l'État, qui sont les territoires, dans certaines collectivités locales. Parfois, c'est même porté par une loi, comme c'est le cas en France, mais elle a fait beaucoup moins de bruit que la loi El Khomri. Des propositions législatives qui viennent soutenir des initiatives locales de remise au travail, d'encouragement au travail des chômeurs de très longue durée. Parce que ça, c'est quand même aussi un problème énorme, c'est que plus d'un tiers des chômeurs sont des chômeurs de longue durée et les 2 tiers de ceux-ci sont des jeunes de moins de 30 ans. Il y a en France et dans d'autres pays des collectivités locales qui s'engagent à mettre en place une expérience du zéro chômage longue durée. Et là, les économistes viennent à l'appui parce qu'ils démontrent que le coût, c'est le chiffre que j'ai retenu, le coût d'un chômeur longue durée pour la collectivité par an, c'est plus de 15 000 €. Eh bien, pourquoi pas placer au sens économique du terme, ces 15 000 € dans un salaire versé à ce chômeur longue durée, auquel serait proposé un emploi d'utilité collective dans le cadre d'entreprises de l'économie sociale et solidaire, avec un contrat de travail à durée indéterminée et avec toutes les protections du droit du travail applicable sur le territoire. C'est tout à fait possible. En fait, il y a des solutions qui ne sont pas des solutions catastrophiques et il suffit simplement de les porter politiquement. Donc ça, c'est une possibilité. Et puis, il y a ensuite le problème auquel nous sommes confrontés, c'est qu'en effet, nous sommes dans des parcours professionnels de plus en plus discontinus. Un peu de travail, parfois un peu de travail salarié, un peu de travail autonome, un peu de travail peut-être en profession libérale, un grand congé parental, un congé formation, etc. Bref, une discontinuité d'activité qui provoque et produit des effets négatifs dans nos systèmes parce que ça crée des coupures dans les droits sociaux et donc dans le statut social de la personne. Et là aussi, il y a des auteurs, dont Alain Supiot ou Jean Boissonnat, qui ont réfléchi il y a longtemps déjà à la question d'un statut de l'État professionnel et donc à mettre en place des systèmes juridiques qui organisent la continuité des ressources dans une discontinuité de parcours professionnel. Alors, je ne veux pas du tout dire que ce qu'on a introduit en France, la législation avec le compte personnel d'activité, la panacée, pas du tout. Je pense qu'on est très loin du projet de statut d'État professionnel. Mais enfin, il y a quelque chose à réfléchir ici. Et puis ensuite, ce qui me semble extrêmement important, c'est que nous voilà confrontés à une segmentation des statuts, à une segmentation des conditions d'emploi et de travail. Il y a d'un côté le travail salarié avec son droit du travail. Il y a de l'autre un travail indépendant qui est sans aucune protection et même dont la protection sociale coûte extrêmement cher. Et ce travail indépendant est de plus en plus un faux travail indépendant. Et on le voit bien avec l'ubérisation, avec le système des plateformes. On en a parlé ce matin. Il y a toute cette histoire de la requalification en contrat de travail dont se chargent les juges. Et puis, il y a des zones grises. Il y a du travail occasionnel, il y a du travail informel. Et donc, ce que je voudrais en fait militer, si c'est possible, pour créer un droit commun du travail, qui soit commun à l'ensemble des personnes qui travaillent, je dis bien des personnes qui travaillent, quel que soit le statut juridique. Et ça me semblerait être un projet...
Philip Jennings, that's a big ask, isn't it? Job sharing, especially with people who are unemployed, bringing them back into the market and having the same rights for everybody.
I think, Nina, I don't know if the cameraman can see this, but these aren't our statistics. I'm not sure if this will show up, but these are the statistics collated by the World Development Report and others, which shows the degree of the job displacement, job description, that we are potentially going to see. The figures are really frightening and extraordinary, and as Professor Comrade Skidelsky mentioned this morning, that we're in a new realm and in a new era. Therefore, we have to use all the tools that we know that do work to try and shape this new reality that we have. The other point that I don't think we've picked up enough is this question, work, society, artificial intelligence, and the questions it puts to our civilization. We are talking about a singularity. We are talking about the development of artificial intelligence, which will be equal to, surpass the cognitive capacity and developments and thought processes of human beings. And therefore, I know Guy probably thinks he has enough conventions on his plate, but there has to be a place for an ethical convention which places some limits around the development of artificial intelligence and its broader application, whether it's terms of war or social or community life. Asimov had a rule which said that robots should do no harm to humans, so I am going to suggest that there will be a new algorithm 8798, and this algorithm 8798 will mean that the robot will ask a question of its co-worker, because they will be working together, are the working conditions in this place subject to ILO standards? I mean, this is a long way from the Freedom of Association Committee guy, but then the robot gets the message, no, then perhaps he or she will have another view about the speed with which they work and their degree of cooperation that they're prepared to display. Thank you.
Marcel van der Linden, do you think that it is a binary argument there, that in the previous industrial revolutions, we saw technology help to sort of upscale the pace of work, to help productivity, to enhance productivity, to create some opportunities, but is this really it? And the problem is this could really lead to job destruction.
How do you mean is this really
Is this different, this fourth industrial revolution with the advent of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, well, first, I think it's not the fourth, but it's the third technological revolution, and only the Germans call it the fourth, I think. Anyway, so in the two previous ones, we saw that, you had, of course, displacement of jobs, and you had the creation of new jobs at the same time. In general, I would say the tendency was that if you count everything together, that there was a loss of jobs, but some of the jobs became higher qualified because people were to repair and invent machines and so on. And this will probably go on. So I don't see it, in this respect, a major difference with the third technological revolution. And the challenges remain, I think, the same, because probably, if you have robotization, the work for those people who keep the work will become more interesting, because robotization means that you have machines doing routine tasks. And routine tasks not just of blue-collar workers, but also of surgeons, lawyers, and so on. And so the work that is non-routine, which is more interesting for most people, that will then remain, unless, of course, there's this undercutting of costs by low-wage labor and so on. And so we will have fewer people doing more interesting work, and the others will lose their jobs. And there we have the major problem, of course, and Keynes' solution of the 15-hour day with full wages, which I think is an excellent solution. I don't know if it's feasible, but I wouldn't be in favor of it. That would lead to this. Otherwise, if you don't have that, then the traditional solutions are apathy, suicide, as we now see in the United States on a massive scale, for instance, and resistance, destruction of machines, Luddism, as we have not seen only in Europe, but also in China, the Ottoman Empire, and so on, and sabotage.
And anti-globalization and
And
nationalism.
anti-globalization, yes. Resistance, of course, also in the more political sense, yes.
So this is the other elephant in the room, I suppose we should talk about, isn't it? The growing calls for anti-globalization from the biggest, most capitalist economies in the world, where the individuals feel
I
they're not
personally
getting
believe
their
that
fair share.
the thing that's happening now, that you have this very high productivity, high profit, and the difference between, I think, between earlier forms of industrialization was what happened to the profit. Today, a lot of profit is financialized. It's not being reinvested to produce more. And this financialization, with huge amounts of money just moving around doing nothing, because of the enormous surpluses that you can generate with today's technology. And until you find ways of fiscally controlling, of making, of the capitalists that earn this, only those that are the investor types, and not to the financial, in a sense, financial repression, if you like, when you introduce some kind of financial repression to make sure that these surpluses can be used for production. But there are a lot of places where people are looking for this money to produce more things. It is this it's going to disconnect between high productivity, profit, and investment. And everybody is complaining about, Trump is complaining about lack of infrastructure. Why? Well, there's lack of infrastructure. Well, the state cannot capture some of these rents that could have been used for infrastructure. And the story repeats itself everywhere. You have this bizarre situation with high productivity, high surpluses, low unemployment because there's no, because mind you, the loss of employment is not only because of productivity. Even in the developed countries, there is less investment.
And there's underemployment.
Yeah, there's less investment, partly because the money is going to the financial sector. So there is a need to reflect on not only the productivity of this of robots, but the amount, who captures this surplus, how much of it goes to those who are likely to invest, how much of it goes to rentiers who will just circulate it around, and how much of that is captured by the state for public goods. And that, I think, that question applies to rich countries, poor countries. To answer this question, who is capturing the surplus that is produced by these high productivity technologies, and why is it that they're not going into productive investments for further growth and job creation?
Imraan, you briefly wanted to contribute to that argument.
I want to kind of link the points that's just been made by Thandika to the issue which I think is the really important thing, which is the kind of question of voice. So I don't know that Philip's going to like what I'm going to say, but I think if we only hang on to the idea of kind of trade unions as the kind of primary form of organization, I think we're not facing up to the evidence that there's declining kind of trade union sort of densities. And I think the one group whose voice is really important to this debate that we don't sort of have enough of is those who are young. So it's not being at a university. It's not often the case that with all of the grey hair that I decrease the average age of the room. But I think here I'm probably doing that. So
Even though apparently, according to our initial poll, 50% of the people in the room were 35 to 54.
But I think trade unions don't sufficiently talk for kind of younger people, and I think these sort of technologies are going to affect younger people a lot more, and I think their voice has to be stronger. The second point to make, which is tied up with the one Thandika's just made, is I think if we think about work over long sort of periods of time, the kind of idea of work being done in the kind of setting that we have now, where you have large firms, multinationals, private ownership, etc., that if you kind of expand your time horizon sufficiently, I think what we've had is a kind of relatively short sort of period of that, and I think some of the problems that we're starting to face kind of around lack of resources, financialization, and so on, lend themselves to thinking about kind of new forms of ownership and new forms of kind of running the production system in a way that would be a lot broader, would sort of encompass a lot more in the gains from production, and I kind of really think so. So on both the union side, and I think also on the employer side, I kind of think both those groups need to be significantly democratized for us to have the conversation in a way that's really going to be inclusive for everyone.
I want to just briefly call upon a member of the audience. The Ambassador Hans Bratskar of Norway, I believe, is in the audience and would like to ask a question. He's not, apologies, apparently he's not here, but I do have a question which comes from Slido. There's been a lot of people in this room who've been quite keen to talk about co-ops and the employment opportunities that they provide in the developing world in particular, but elsewhere. We haven't really had a chance to address that, and that's key to sort of work in society in the future, isn't it, Professor?
Well, I'm not a specialist on co-ops, but I know that well, in Africa there have been a lot of experiments, usually donor-driven experiments on co-ops, which have lacked one fundamental thing about co-ops, that it has been based on some notion of solidarity. If you don't have that, you will have serious problems with collective action. So which takes us back again, that the only way you can confront machines is through an ideology and a normative discourse, which they don't have. And co-ops can save an important role. They will probably become, these new technologies allow for all kinds of organization. I mean, and we've just been made to think about the market as being the only way of distributing resources. You can't do that through hierarchies, through co-op, through teams, or through the market. And maybe co-ops will become part of the solution to that. But I wouldn't want to preempt other forms of organization. But I do want to insist that the handling of new technologies, we should not forget, technology is a social production. They are produced by human beings, and therefore we are quite capable of controlling them. And we want to do that with a social agenda. If we don't have a social agenda, the machines will look as if they are fetish coming from somewhere else. Same thing with cooperatives. In other words, I'm trying to say that I want to start off with some idea, as it were, kind of an ideational framing of the issues before I get to institutions. We'll get to institutions, but let's get this idea of norms that will guide these institutions, whether they are co-ops or or the state or. So I would insist on something which I think has not come up quite strongly, on the norms of this future and who are going to be the agents of this future. It's just like a norm we're hurtling towards without no norms, no actors. As I said, I found that all the actors had somehow been removed from the scene. And
can I pick up on that? I think that's a very important point. There's a great tendency to rush to solutions. And the solutions we know are the ones we're familiar with. So when we look towards the future, we say, aha, it's co-ops. Aha, it's this. And I think instead it's about defining what the issues are in a neutral way, trying to understand what the drivers are behind these forces, understand what the implications are first and foremost for individuals. And only when we understand that can we then start to look at what the institutional solutions are. Otherwise, the danger is we'll run back to mama, to what we know, and we'll try and force fit what we understand to be the future back into patterns and structures that we've developed in the past. I think that's a very important point.
Well, on that note, because we're about to wrap things up, I'd like to ask each of our panelists where they think the future of work and society, the relationship between the two is heading, and what recommendations you would have, because obviously we're here to inform the debate so that recommendations can be made. I'll start out with you, Peter, and take it.
Can I go last?
If you want.
You know what, I think I've probably given my point just in response here. I would go back to something Lord Skidelsky said this morning. He drew a distinction between the transition and the new future when we get there. We're in a transition period now, and the challenges that we face in a transition are probably going to be different than the challenges society will face 40 or 50 years from now when it's settled down. The challenges we faced in the 1920s when we were transitioning through the third revolution are different than those we faced in the 70s and the 80s. And so the one piece that I think perhaps has not come out this morning is to divide this issue as well between the transitional challenges we're facing today as we move towards some new thing and what that new thing will look like. And throughout all that, for me, the key point here is we must be focused on ensuring the welfare of individuals and households. And everything else comes second. The institutions, the structures, the formats that we have must serve the interests of people, families, and households before they serve their own interests.
Marcel,
your thoughts? Three small points, or small. One is, of course, if all the conventions of the ILO would be ratified by everybody and would be implemented, then we would already have a much better world. But there's a problem here, of course, and that is that ILO is structurally, it has no right to sanction, it has no independent labor inspection, and of course, since the rise of neoliberalism, its position has been weakened in competition with IMF and World Bank and so on. So the first thing that should happen is the ILO should become stronger. And how this is to be done, I leave to you. The second thing is that I would support all the efforts to strengthen the position of employees, whom you would perhaps no longer call employees sometimes, in their bargaining position with their employers, which also means that I would support the idea of strengthening cooperatives, producer cooperatives. Now, according to the International Cooperative Association, there are 10 million workers in producer cooperatives out of the 3 billion workforce in the world. So this is a tiny proportion, and I think this will never become the majority, or at least not in my lifetime. But by legal support and practical support, also by governments, I think this could be improved, and training is important, financial security and so on, because many of these co-ops collapse after a number of years. There's a whole literature on why this happens. And finally, I think in response to all these developments, the trade union should become less satisfied with its own achievements and be open to more new possibilities.
Briefly, Professor, your thoughts?
Well, I would that's rather insist somehow that we ought to democratize our discourse on the future. I mean, that we shouldn't only have one part of the world defining the future, and that not only one class or one, we should colonize the future together, and that means, if you like, to democratize the future, the discourse on the future much more, and ILO can take a lead in the UN system because of its tripartite nature. You might actually force many more actors to engage in this debate about the future.
I'm going to ask the last two panelists ever so quickly, just one thought.
Right, three, if I can quickly.
As long as they're brief.
Okay. So the first point is, I think we have to broaden the conception of work to include work that is not paid. I think care work is really the part of work that we do the most of, and it seems to me it's the part that is going to be kind of probably the least affected. I mean, we can't really sort of get our we can't really get our machines to do care work with the love that we do it, and I think that's an important issue. The second issue is around inequality. I think we kind of have to think about a lot more sort of the democratic forms of organization, and I think we've spoken a lot about inequality within countries. I think we haven't spoken enough about kind of inequality across the globe, and I think technology kind of has democratized things across the globe, and I think it's kind of probably going to do that a lot more, and I think we have to grasp that challenge, and we have to do it jointly. I think thirdly, on the issue of taxation and social sort of policy programs, it seems to me that the basic income grant idea should get a lot more traction.
Isabelle Daugareilh, brièvement, s'il vous plaît.
Je dirais qu'il faut peut-être prendre garde à deux choses. On n'a pas beaucoup parlé ce matin d'un processus qui est à l'œuvre, en tout cas on ne l'a pas exprimé dans le cadre des nouvelles technologies, c'est celui de l'invisibilisation du pouvoir et donc des responsabilités qui, lorsqu'on tire profit de l'activité d'autrui, doivent être prises en charge par ce que l'on nomme dans le droit classique l'employeur. Donc je crois qu'on est en face d'un nouveau processus d'invisibilisation. On l'a vu avec les chaînes globales de valeur, il en sera question plus tard. C'est un double processus d'invisibilisation. Je pense qu'il faut absolument travailler sur, d'un point de vue juridique, sur ces nouvelles formes d'organisation, de pouvoir et de responsabilité. Et deuxièmement, je redis ce que j'ai dit tout à l'heure, et ça rejoint l'idée d'ouvrir la notion de travail, de ne pas réserver les règles au travail salarié. Je suis vraiment en faveur d'un droit commun du travail parce que c'est ça qui fait ciment entre toutes les régions du monde et entre tous les travailleurs qui participent à une œuvre collective ici ou là.
Merci. I know you'll be bold, Philip Jennings, but I'll also ask you to be brief.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think the ILO is brilliantly placed to set the terms for this debate, where it is situated in the constellation of the UN system and elsewhere. There will not be a political party anywhere that is not grappling with this issue. When we see the degree of job displacement and ripples from that, there's going to be a demand for solutions and for answers, demands for new scenarios, what works, what doesn't work. So I see the ILO right at the center of this new universe of the conversation about the future of work. The data that the ILO supplies is essential in terms of the work they do on the world employment market, in terms of wages, and in terms of future job trends. It would be good to invest more in what do the future employment trends look like to give us the data upon which we can make decisions. Secondly, I am mightily encouraged by the wishes of many of the panelists that we become smarter and brighter and more powerful in the labour movement. I should be dancing off this podium with a lightness in my step and with great encouragement. We've never stopped innovating and changing. Our lives are always been about change. Changing politics, changing economics, changing business practices. We have to make sense of it and we have to adapt. When it's difficult to organize, we transform into a social movement. The 15 for 15 campaign in the United States of America is perhaps the way to go. Maybe we might be less strong institutionally, which I wouldn't like to see, but our ability to organize and mobilize should never be underestimated. When you look at the opinions of young people about the world that they would like to see, then they are very similar with the principles and values that this labor movement has stood for. So therefore, the relationships with NGOs and others, I think, would be very powerful. There's two quotes I could finish with here. I'm from Wales, so it's a pretty dark place sometimes, and Dylan Thomas said, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." That's not the message coming from here. I prefer George Bernard Shaw. Perhaps it'll be the opening sentence of Guy's report. "You see things and you say, why? But I dream of things that never were, and I say, why not?" This is the why not moment for the ILO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, on that encouraging note, thank you to all of the panellists today. Just a quick housekeeping note for everybody in the room. We're going to break for lunch. I'd remind you that the session 2 starts here at 2:30 p.m. And I'd also like to ask those who are participating as panellists in session 2, which is obviously all about decent jobs for all, to come to the stage here for a quick briefing so that we can gather you in one place. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to the panellists.